Nigeria's economic woes also help to explain a significant rise in crime. More people are kidnapped in the first 4 months of this year than all of last year, according to World Bank and UNICEF statistics. This has added to worsening violence around 3 flashpoints: the insurgency in the Northeast, a long-standing conflict between farmers and cattle herders across central Nigeria, and fighting between government forces and Igbo separatists in the Southeast. I will focus on the Northeast while we look at some of the education issues there. Also, Nigeria developmentally ranks about 150 from 157 countries in the Human Capital Index. There's a burgeoning youth population, high poverty levels, and importantly for this study and for all of us here, large numbers of out-of-school children. I explained to you something about the security challenges. The important thing here also is to understand that Nigeria is extremely vulnerable right now to the global economic shocks. Because of COVID-19, oil accounts for 80% of the exports, and 40% of Nigeria's population lives below the poverty line. About 53% of these are in the Northeast. So we are looking at a situation of insecurity and instability that originated in a problematic unification of Nigeria's 2 separate and distinct British colonial protectorates. This situation has been unresolved since 1960. It resulted in a war in 67 to 1970, in which about 2 million people died, mostly from starvation and disease. The all-ruling Congress party here controls the executive, holds a majority of seats in the parliament, and about 23 of the 26 state governorships. President Muhammadu Buhari secured a second term in the 2019 presidential elections, and general elections now are scheduled for February 2023. There are bright spots here. There's a growing middle class, a burgeoning film, music, TV, and IT industry, and people questing for reform. However, the resources still remain concentrated at the federal level, though policy reforms have been instituted. So you're looking at a situation where Nigeria's average population growth will double in the year 2015 to almost 400 million. So we have challenges of scarce resources compounded by this population growth, poor governance, over-centralization, mismanagement and corruption, regional ethnic tensions, degradation of the environment, and massive demographic pressures. Next slide, please. So when we look at this context, we realize education is severely challenged. 10.5 million children are out of school. Let me repeat this. In 2019, 10.5 million children were out of school in Nigeria. And let's telescope this now to the Northeast. The challenge is even more significant in the Northeast. Though primary education is officially free and compulsory, we are looking at only 61% of the 6 to 11-year-olds regularly attend primary school, of which only 35.6% of children aged 36 to 59 months receive early childhood education. So the access to education is limited. Insurgency by the Jamaat al-Sunnah il-Dawa wal-Jihad, or the Boko Haram, have targeted schools for violent attacks, kidnapping students, bombing markets, bus shelters, government buildings. This is according to UNICEF 2019 and UNHCR reports. At the very core, this dissident resistance is based on ideology that is opposed to Western values. The group derives its name from the Hausa word. Boko Haram means education of the Western variety, the colonial variety in their minds, is forbidden and in fact taboo. This rejection of Western values is because Boko Haram feels, and groups affiliated to Boko Haram feel, that there has been a neo-colonization of their cultural values, aspirations, and the growth of their educational systems. From colonial times, this grievance, this DNA of grievance has been, you can pull the thread. The Boko Haram feel that the elite have been insensitive to educational challenges and aspirations of Muslim youth in the Northeast. They have showed it with manifestations that have become progressively more violent. The Chibok kidnapping was one of a series of such abductions of school kids, and school children have been targeted by Boko Haram, especially ones going to secular schools. This compounds the already low enrollment rate. The government has responded to this by a military offensive, an extremely militarized response to Boko Haram's dissidents. And this military response has further jeopardized education provision in the Northeast. It's only grown in scale and intensity after the death of Muhammad Yusuf, the founder of Boko Haram. And the government has declared a state of emergency in 2013. People have died, millions of people have died, they have been displaced, and education, if not stopped, has been completely truncated in certain areas. Despite repeated declarations of victory, this counterinsurgency has dragged on for more than a decade. And education has been seriously compromised and implicated. Next slide, please. Thank you, Tejendra. The consequences of this conflict, and I'll let you all read this for a moment, is severe. Almost 2 million children are in need of education assistance. 500 classrooms have been destroyed. Almost 400 classrooms are in need of repair since 2017. And more than 2 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, and about 1 million or so are out of the reach of humanitarian assistance. So we are looking at a situation where we have really focused on the problematic of education provision. Next slide, please, Tejendra. We can see now in the Northeast area where I'm doing my study, especially in the Bay states, the states of Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe. And I'll focus on Borno and Adamawa states. There are multiple actors and influences in this education space. We have, of course, security actors. We have dissident groups. Boko Haram has joined forces with the self-styled Islamic State of Western Sahara. We have government and donor groups. We have local communities. This research then sets out to examine how do local communities, from the perspectives of select participants, navigate the diverse influences that shape the provision of education. And for all of us, what are the implications for social cohesion and peace? Let's move on to the next slide. Thank you, Tejendra. And I'll just focus on a couple of points in the interest of time for this case study. It's a qualitative case study, and we're looking at the overall scholarly literature review of education and conflict, and all the arguments that are encompassed within this particular review. I did semi-structured interviews with a range of participants. Now, here's where it gets interesting and challenging. This is really data collection in the era of COVID, and many of you may be going through this phenomena. And I really thank Tejendra, Elaine, and Alex when they advised me through sort of the hurdle of the ethics phenomena. The first issue, as we realize, is do no harm. I was ready to go to Borno and Adamawa states, but I could not go because the level of insecurity was rising. And the pandemic outbreak had just started, and the cases were starting to spike. Under advice from my community contacts, the US Embassy, the British Embassy, and discussions with my advisors, and then of course USCL had started to promote the fact that we could do some form of hybrid data collection. I decided in the interest of ethical constraints, it's better that I don't go. If I had gone to those sites in this situation, I would have had to have police and military escort. And with the raging pandemic, I would have further jeopardized the communities who were going to help me and provide information for this study. I would have contravened ethical standards, and I would have compromised the very people whom I was starting to connect with and who were going to be participants of this study. I would have become a liability in the community, in the university and in the work that we are doing. So after sort of thinking about this, I gathered data through multiple means: WhatsApp, through digital platforms, WhatsApp, Google, Zoom, phone, email, always keeping in mind that communities and people who I interviewed should feel perfectly free to talk. They all signed consent forms, or I recorded their consent. They could walk away at any point when the conversation became something too sensitive for them. I wanted to ensure consent, confidentiality, and care of those interviewed. Several people that I interviewed, I followed up via WhatsApp. We had very frank conversations, and people were freed up to talk, perhaps in a way, and I was surprised by this, that visiting them may not have given them the advantage. And somehow this impersonal platform made them open up. I could see their body language. They could talk to me. And actually, when I was talking to my advisors, we got tremendous amount of information that impressed me. And also the problem was juggling all this information. Next slide, please. So here's what I did. I looked at the findings, and then I looked at the counterinsurgency framework as a tool to frame these findings. Counterinsurgency framework has helped me to generate a more in-depth and contextualized sort of understanding of how conflict has shaped the dynamics of education provision in Northeast Nigeria. The Department of Defense Field Manual of 2006, is Field Manual 324, looks at counterinsurgency via a clear, hold, and build phenomena. That's the approach to counterinsurgency. Now, briefly, clear means the evacuation of areas for military operation. You clear them of supposed dissidents, insurgents, people who are disaffected. Hold means you hold the territory that potentially was taken over, and Boko Haram took territory almost the size of Belgium in the Northeast. And you secure those territories. It's militarized attempts actually to regain and secure territories and local communities from insurgents. And build then attempts to repair these territories with the help of government and donor interventions. And I added two more constructs to this frame. I looked at clarify, that I actually talked to communities of how they made sense and prioritized what was going on in this clear, hold, and build construct. And then I looked at collaborate. How do communities come together to build peace in the provision of education? How do they leverage education for community cohesion? So I'm explaining these findings through the lens of the counterinsurgency. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about the findings, and I'll focus in on a couple of them. Firstly, the militarized offensive, instead of bringing peace, quickly exacerbated the conflict, and Nigeria's overstretched, under-resourced, and corruption-plagued military struggled to consolidate its gains with negative implications for education provision. People have been housed in garrison towns, and there's truncated, if not stymied, education provision, with residents displaced and participants sharing the education space with displaced people. There are part-time lessons and facilitators trained as teachers, owing to the shortage of teachers. Participants have noted that the demarcation between garrison towns and a lawless countryside for them, quote unquote, the military, means people have a choice. They live in virtual quarantine in these garrison towns, or they return to their homes in the countryside where military actors, dissidents roam around freely, and people are worried that they'll be taken as potential sympathizers. There's a civilian joint task force. It's a loose group of militants that is formed from the community that has been formed in Maiduguri in Borno State in Nigeria to help oust, from the military perspective, the insurgents. This group possesses basic weapons. They set out to protect the population and the education space. However, based on participant findings, there have been significant human rights violation of the education community, detainment, harassment, and threats to divulge information and whereabouts of Boko Haram. So the education space, and there's lots of literature on this, Ferrari, Novelli, Lopez, Cardoso Lopez, and others have written about the securitization of this space. They face ongoing threats now, both from insurgent attacks, because there are soldiers in the education space, as well as counterterrorism operations. Next slide, please. Let's look at the build findings. There's a complicity and multiplicity of motivations, interests between government and donors and other stakeholders. Instead of streamlining education provision, this has resulted in complicating this and actually undermining the provision of education. The Nigerian officials' initial reluctance to engage outside partners inhibited government and intergovernment agency responses, which was detrimental to education provision. They complicated the already complex donor processes became further complicated, and both sides did not talk to each other, or sort of talked past each other. So important initiatives like education cannot wait, education in emergencies, safe school declarations had halting starts, and communities were enmeshed in this. They had to act as interlocutors, local NGOs, to explain to donors what communities were doing, what they needed in the education space. And they had to quell community suspicions about this influx of outsiders who had come to support them. And these things took time. There was a norming, forming, and storming. Currently, there's an uptick in education provision, but in the main, education is still stymied, and many people cannot access education provision. And sizable parts of Northeast Nigeria are still inaccessible to local NGOs. So there is enormous amounts of money now being spent, but there's also corruption. There are the issues that communities say education has not reached them. And when it does reach them, it's very difficult for them to really sort out, especially for minority communities, people who don't speak, say, Hausa, who are speaking Kanuri. There are not enough textbooks for them. And we can talk a lot about this, time permitting. Let's go on to the next slide. In the clarify phase, this is how do communities make sense of what's going on. The first thing which is surprising to me in these findings was security was considered important for communities. A founder of an NGO told me and reminded me that security provided by armed services is very much needed, but not to protect the security of the territory, but to protect the basic survival of the community. Another participant told me that poverty is an inescapable fact, inescapable throughout this construct, this rising tide of violence by the military forces, by this unending conflict. And the shortage of all basic services has really made them clarify and often deprioritize education because of the poverty. A mother told me, and she said that if I have to send my child to school and he's hungry and sleeping, it's very difficult for me to make him walk in an insecure environment where the police or the military will stop him. Another participant told me, I have 6 children and 1 pair of shoes. Who goes to school? Which day? How do I work this out? This juxtaposition of views is very important to understand. On the one hand, all participants discuss the criticality of personal security, but they're not convinced that this security environment actually gives them the security that they need. And they are worried that this military is not reliable enough or strong enough to protect them. Then we look at this broken student-teacher link. For centuries in Northeast Nigeria, the concept of teaching formally, informally, religious education has been broken. And that is sort of the pathos of this situation. What is evident is that the participants lamented and expressed grief at this broken student link, teacher-student link, because of the insecurity and because of the fact that religious education is also suspect by the military and by the fact that they can't get to their students. So teachers, poorly paid, poorly trained, many of them, this was their dignity, this was what they gave back to their communities, are unable to fulfill their functions as alims, teachers to their community. Several teachers also said that our centuries-long tradition has been broken by this counterinsurgency. Let's go on to the next slide. Thank you. Now we look at how communities cohere. What is the linkage to peace? And there's an evolving cohesion with both positive and negative impacts on education provision. Peace building in the local context is framed and acted upon initially with the use of arms because of this counterinsurgency, and securitized protection is largely a top-down approach. This is very much like Galtung's sort of notion of the negative peace. Internal NGOs have also attempted to catalyze peace. The International Organization of Migration has actually brought communities together to start talking and cohering in the provision of education, which is showing some results. Communities are also using key influencers to leverage and politicize education and gain political support for their communities, and often, sometimes, sadly, against the other community. There's been finger pointing, and there's been sort of blaming of one or the other group for the burning of their churches, their schools, their mosques, and their flock. Pastors and imams have come together. There has been great progress, but this politicization by one group or the other has factionalized communities and has truncated social cohesion. We'll go on to the next slide, and then we'll talk a little bit about the COVID-19 situation as well. What is the synthesis of all these findings? Firstly, the major cause of this insurgency has resulted in a diminished trust in leaders. Participants explained to me that when people believe that their leaders don't care, and they can be spurred on to join forces who might demonstrate that they do care. There is this now competing thrust for sovereignty and the reach of the state, but education has been bypassed and ignored in this sort of competing situation. Then the motivations of donors, the sort of talking past each other, complex situations, different priorities, has also complicated the repair and recovery of the education space, though progress is being made now. In practice, education assistance came late. Many donors struggled to identify viable national counterparts for their programs. Funding for education, despite promises, fell short of goals. Now there is progress being made, but I fear it might be too little and too late. There are several bright spots, though, one might say. For example, technical capacity building done by UNDP. USAID is supporting education provision through Education Cannot Wait and Education in Emergencies. And there are Nigerian entrepreneurs and billionaires like Aliko Dangote who are trying to support the education space. COVID-19 has become an enormous detriment. It's another layer upon all these complex layers. This closure of schools from March 2020 impacted close to 46 million people, with 4.2 million of these children in Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe states. That's the Bay States, Northeast Nigeria. I'm focusing on Borno and Adamawa. All schools in Nigeria were actually closed from March 27, 2020, as the federal government measures to limit the spread of the disease. Now, this translated into about 38 states in the country. The impact of this was hardest, of course, on the Northeast. The learning that was provided through long distance and virtual learning, TV, internet, and radio did not reach people in the Northeast. So marginalized and disadvantaged learners were further marginalized and disadvantaged. Though higher education tried to refurbish radio programs, tried to do education in a bag, tried to go to different communities, again, the reach of this has been severely detrimental to people who are already struggling to gain education access. So the students' inability to engage in an online environment in this current situation also undermines education provision. And Elaine Unterholter and I believe Tejendra have started to work more on this situation. As I said, there are pockets of success, but in the main, the picture is still a little dire in terms of reach for children, given this COVID-19 context. Just another devil, as one participant said, amongst all the other devils that have come to plague us. So then we'll turn to the last slide, and here's where I need your help. How is peace in all this crazy, this wicked problem set? How is peace then engendered? One way is that you align with national and local stakeholders and donors, and local communities have done that. They have tried to look at ex-combatants and provide them with education. They've also said, if you provide ex-combatants with education, provide 2 of our students with education. So it's a 1+2 bargain they've done with the state. They have exercised agency to come together have meals, do informal education. Pastors and imams have got together, besides the politicization, to say this is bleeding our children. Let's talk about education provision. Now, how else in your minds can peace and social cohesion be engendered? What do you all suggest? And I'm grappling with that as I'm starting to think about the discussion phase. So over to you all, either by chat or Tejendra, they can put their hands up, however you feel. But I really appreciate you all listening. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, so thank you so much, Vanita. That was really, really interesting. And I think the most troublesome aspect in the model that you were trying to explain for me was this idea of build and the counterinsurgency model often tends to kind of think about conflict in a linear fashion, that you clear and hold and then build and move on. But increasingly we see violent conflicts being protracted. And that's why I think increasingly scholars have stopped using the idea of this post-conflict, that when countries or societies are affected by conflict, the legacies of violence are prolonged. And there's also a risk of societies relapsing into violence. So a lot of that challenge around build is certainly what you were describing in the context of Nigeria. So thank you, and also well done on successfully conducting your field work in those very challenging times of COVID-19, when we are all trying to adapt the new situation, and certainly collecting data in low-income contexts is always difficult, and it is even more difficult in circumstances that have been affected by violence. So I think there are complexities multiplied because of COVID-19. So with something called, complex emergencies, if you like. So thanks very much. So I will open the floor for questions or comments. Please feel free to just jump in. We are a small group of audience, so please, if you can, turn your video on and tell us who you are and make a comment or ask your question. You can also raise your hand if you would like. And also, colleagues here, please feel free to ask questions. Okay, yes, Sadaf, yeah. Let's try and hear if you can hear Vanita. Otherwise, I can repeat the question. Sadaf Yasir is here in the room, and she's going to ask.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Vanita about your theoretical perspectives, as you said, like.
Can you hear, Vanita?
It's a little muddled.
Yeah, maybe a bit louder, Sadaf. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to ask about your theoretical perspectives, that you use the lens of the counterinsurgency, and what else did you use in your studies? What helped you, and in what areas? Secondly, as you said, like your suggestions. So I just wanted to see about the donors and the national stakeholders, as you said, like if the area is like the Boko Haram area, or the area which is in their hold. So the mosque leaders or the imams of masajid also, and the girls, or the generally the right to education under Islam. So probably that would help if we just zoom into that, and also about theoretical perspectives. I wanted to know that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fascinating question. And it's a three-part question, Sadat. So the first thing was, when you look at the lens of the counterinsurgency, I also used, of course, a participant perspectives helped. They lived through it, and there was a gamut of participants. And of course, I looked at scholarly literature in terms of post-conflict, in terms of post-colonial, and education and conflict writ large, and education and international development. And also when you look at the religious leaders, now the limitation of my study was that I could not focus on the gender perspective, really the women perspective. And perhaps that's an outlet for another time. But as you rightly point out, that the imams who are teaching in masjids, who are the ma'alims, who are teaching the students, for them, the critical perspective was really important. Initially, they said that this is not Islam, this is not our religion, we don't believe in violence. Violence against one is violence against all. But they had grievance against the state. They felt that the state had neglected education provision. And when they did, they forced situations on them which were untenable to their way of life. For example, they said, on Fridays, you have exams for our students. Fridays is when we go to the mosque. How are we supposed to have exams for our students? Sunday, you have a holiday, so the Christians can relax. So you could already see these tensions against the state and sort of this, how should I say, this lack of nuance and the lack of sensitivity to some of the communities in the Northeast. All of this was what was being sort of broadcast by the dissidents of the Boko Haram. Boko Haram never started off as violent. They were exhortive, preaching community that got more violent because they felt that the state was corrupt. So there was a genuine grievance which had this kind of historical linkage. I hope that answered your question. So that's a great question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Vanita. Any other questions or comments from colleagues? Yeah. Liz, you're flashing. Yeah, go on.
Yes, thanks so much, Vanita, for the presentation. I wanted to know if you thought in the context that you were looking at, if education had the potential to more contribute to peace or exacerbate the conflict and kind of exacerbate some of the issues of trust that you described.
So Liz, this is a great question and very Bush and Saltarelli of you, the two faces of education provision. I think it's both in Northeast Nigeria. I mean, the fact is that many of these communities didn't ask for this war and this conflict. It was visited upon them and they were literally hapless in this situation. Given the overwhelming situation of this conflict, many of them have actually found agency, poverty, I mean, displacement, violence, desolation, decimation of their lifestyle. They have actually found agency to come together despite all of this, to forgive, to carry on, because they realize that education, their children have to read and write. This is part of their cultural precepts. However, there is also the situation that the national government is in this sort of turmoil. They want to keep the cultural consistency, but they also are promoting secular education. And there is resistance towards this. Now, in the main, access to education is limited. And that's the frightening issue, that many of these school children are going to be out of school, and it's a generational problem with long-term repercussions. And I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Liz.
Yeah, thanks, Vanita. Yusuf.
Hello, thank you very much for your informative talk. I just had a question regarding the concept of education itself and how you think perhaps a limitation on what education actually constitutes may contribute to the issues that are being faced in Nigeria, in the Northeast at the moment.
So Yusuf, tell me what you're thinking, because I know there's a thought behind your question.
Yes, so if we take one form of education to include everything that education could be, how does that allow for other forms of what, for example, Boko Haram see as education to take place? For like in terms of madrasas, for example, madrasas could be teaching mathematics, science, arithmetics, and maybe basic philosophy and logic. But would that still be considered adequate education by the state? And would the state allow for, or not the state, or even communities would allow that to take hold and perhaps open some space for dialogue within madrasas and formal institutes?
So Yusuf, that is such a fascinating question, because when Boko Haram started, I mean, Boko Haram's, Muhammad Yusuf's philosophy became more draconian than his own advisor, preceptor, Adamo. And they studied in the Salafi school, but they studied in Saudi when Muhammad Yusuf actually broke apart from his own sort of teachers. While Boko Haram used phones and used technology, they actually debunked many of the educational claims that climate change was man-made, that women should be studying, that mathematics, unless it was Sharia prescribed, was not a formal, at least from the secular perspective. Astronomy, which was discovered in the Arabian Peninsula, that's the form of astronomy we should be using. However, the Islamia schools is exactly the kinds of schools that are promoted by the state now, which has a formulation of both scientific sort of pedagogy as well as scriptural pedagogy, so that the students learn both. And the talim, or the education that they receive, is a mixture of both. Now, how far that has been accepted, because parents are beginning to realize that when they send their children to learn from their professors, and many people came from Niger into Nigeria to study with, respected ma'alims, that many of these perhaps it's not enough. They need to do a hybrid. But Boko Haram, that is joined with the Islamic State, is using this as a crutch to debunk all forms of education. And that's why they've gone a little more extreme than even what their advisors and teachers taught them. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Yusuf, for that question, and thanks, Vanita. I'm also looking at the room if there are any questions, but also I can see Leticia raising her hand.
Hi, Leticia.
Hi.
How are you?
All right.
Leticia, you're next.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead, Leticia.
Hello to Vanita and to everyone in the room. I'm Leticia. I'm an EdD candidate at IOE, and I'm wrapping up my data collection on refugee education in Indonesia. And it seems like Vanita and I are at a very similar stage in our doctoral journey, that we've experienced some of the same challenges in regards to renavigating our methodology during the pandemic. And Vanita, I'm curious to learn more about how you identified and connected with participants, with your research participants, one on a practical level, but also how you were able to make that human connection, because it sounds like we both did our data collection largely online. Would love to hear more about that from you. Thank you.
That's a great question. So, initially I was all prepared to go as Tejendra and Elaine. I was so excited, and I had started to have conversations, and then the ethics review started, and then the security situation became worse. And as I was starting to email people, it was a snowballing, participant process. One participant would introduce me to another, so I would first form personal connections with them. And before I even started the interview, once Tejendra had told me that he walked with several of his own sort of participants, and I walked with them sort of informally and long distance. So we would first have a chat by WhatsApp and say, I'm so-and-so. I know that you have been immersed in this situation. I would learn a lot from you. Would you be willing to talk? These are the types of questions I'd ask. And tell me a little bit about your family. So I'd first start off with that. Then I would start off by actually having the interview. So sometimes that interview process could be 2 or 3 phases long. And then I actually paid for some students to take transport because they couldn't get to a computer center to send me their responses because WhatsApp kept getting cut off. So I got to know them, and this process was prolonged. Even though I'm making it sound easy, it was prolonged. It was chunky, clunky at times. One participant burst into tears because they remembered something that happened to their family. We had to cut off the interview. One participant scolded me nonstop throughout the interview. But that was a form of trust building, that he felt, he was a teacher, he felt like he could scold me throughout, but I gained a lot from him. The security officials, because they weren't in their offices, actually spoke, and I was pretty shocked at the things that they said. They were so frank and free. And I think this sort of virtual environment gave people a level of, should I say, freedom, of liberty that would have been different if I'd come with armed guards into that situation, or I would have looked definitely an outsider. So they would probably have told me what I wanted to hear. Did that make sense, Leticia?
Yeah, but that's really interesting, isn't it? And thanks, Leticia, for that question. That there are 2 sides of it. One thing that I've learned over the last 2 years is that when you have already built up a particular type of relationship with people, then moving into online is not so detrimental, because you can actually go back to the memory of in-person socialization, conversations and meetings, etc. But building up relationship with people who you've never met in person is I think is sometimes, you know, challenging to build up that rapport. I think you call that human connection, Leticia.
Yeah.
But also looking at the other side of the way that research is conducted in conflict affected contexts, because of security reasons, where the researcher may have to actually travel to the field with the armed guards, you know, as Vanita is talking about, certainly, which is something that I experienced when I was working in Somalia. That, you know, that creating this opportunity to have conversations online, if that is possible, if that is allowed, you know, with the help of technology, is probably there's some kind of benefit as well, where more safety can be guaranteed, you know, while having those conversations. Of course, there are issues around that. We need to be you know, careful about how we interact with participants online, because we don't know the circumstances where they are actually based in. But in some ways, there are certain benefits as well, in my view, which Vanita has managed to navigate. So thank you so much for all of those questions and
Tejaita, there's one more question from Reem.
Okay, that's great. Okay, Reem. Reem, would you like to come in, or you would like me to? Well, Reem, yeah, Reem is here. Would you like to come in and ask your question quickly?
Yes.
Hi, Reem.
You're on mute again for some reasons.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Go on.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Sorry, I'm trying to put the video on, but anyway, if it doesn't come on. Yeah, so my question was, I guess, to do with this idea of trust that you said, you know, there are issues of trust that the participants had with state actors, but then you said, you know, there were some bright spots in what was being done and what will happen, hopefully. And you said that's more to do with community actors, but also like USAID and UNDP. And yeah, the question is, how is trust established between these actors and the people and the communities?
It's not easy. And there were great politics, Reem. So that's a great question. Many people thought that many of the donors actually funded the Boko Haram and funded insurgency, and now they had come to create further problems. And initially, donors were clumsy. They did not involve local communities as effectively. They have their own methodology. They were following it. We were told to follow this methodology. You're responsible to your taxpayer. You have to, and you will be audited by the Inspector General with a drop of the hat. So you have to be very careful about how the funding is being spent. The Nigerian government was adamant that we had to follow their processes. And the local communities were caught in the middle of all of this. So we really had to get trusted NGO interlocutors who spoke English, Hausa, Kanuri, could talk to, and some of them were religious leaders, some of them were community participants and community activists who could talk to their own people and say, yes, you're getting bags and you're getting books, but you are the ones who are going to lead your own education system. The donors don't know more than you do. They will enable you. They had to then talk back to the donors and say, do not wag your finger at the religious leader and the community partner there. Not because sometimes you know this, but you're so mired in your own perspective that it's very difficult to step out of your own perspective and look at what's happening in the local community. You're seeing death, destruction, chaos, rubble. But what you're not seeing is people have these historical and huge sort of connections with their communities. Much of it is fractured, but the memory is there. How do you bring out the best in that in order to provide education? What's that melange that you can formulate? What's that cohesion, not only between communities, but between donors, communities, and the state? And sometimes third parties, because you don't have the baggage, sometimes the government has, you might actually be more effective, or maybe not. So there's a lot of translation and introduction and one step forward, two steps back before you actually start doing this work. And there are slips up the way because goods and supplies don't reach the people who they're supposed to. There's corruption, there's skimming off the top. What stomach and appetite do we have to say, okay, there will be some of this, but at least in the main, education can get through or provisions can get through. Does that make sense, Reem?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Reem. Thank you, Vanita. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time, and I really, really appreciate that. I think it's really interesting research, and Vanita, we really look forward to reading your full, piece of your work. I know that you are getting there, and thank you for joining from all the way from Ghana, and hope you have a great flight back to the United States. And thank you everyone for joining today's meeting. And remember that these webinars take place the last Friday of every month from 12 to 1. And the same Zoom link works. And we look forward to meeting with you in the next webinar. And I will be sending you information. And thank you for joining today. So I hope you have a lovely day today. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Tejendra. And thank you to everybody. I really, really learned a lot and I really enjoyed this. So I very much appreciate your time on this and your listening ears. Thank you.